I want to just briefly touch on some assessment for areas that you want to look at in terms of indications and assessing child abuse and neglect. Environmental clues, parental clues or information, physical indicators in kids, and behavioral indicators. So when you do home visits, I'm of the belief that when I go into the home with clients, I learn more in an hour than I learn in 2 years of seeing them in my office. It's astounding how much information you get. And you also get to directly see the child's environment. But you want to look for things like environmental hazards or problems that aren't being taken care of. And what I've been struck by are parents who, in the very poorest of one neighborhood, I walked into this house, there'd been a drive-by shooting the night before. Their not so large picture window had been shot out, but there was not a shard of glass to be found. The mom had taken not a broom, but cardboard, moved it all into the garbage, had put up cardboard on the window, and was very concerned about it both being cold and also the threat to her kids. I mean, it was very clear that she was concerned about her kids' well-being. What you're looking for are hazardous conditions over which the parent has some control, because it may be that they've called the super 5 times about the rats, and they've brought in as well somebody who they've paid, but the rats have not gone away because they're living all around in the neighborhood, not just in their apartment. That wouldn't be necessarily a parent's neglect. A report may or may not help, but you want to look to the environment and look to what the parent has some control over, and also what threatens the kid's welfare, even if the parent has control. You look for health risks like filthy floors, feces that's animal feces around the house, that sort of thing. Parental clues include behavior or statements by parents. And the parent's behavior, some of you have experienced this, where you're working with a parent and they are profoundly uninterested in their child. Now, I'm not talking about the situation which any of us who have been parents, even kids, know about, where you're interviewing the dad and the kid's going, "Dad, Dad, Dad," and he's having a conversation with you, and he says, "Hold on, kiddo, Dad, Dad." That's not profound neglect of the child. But where the child has a real need, or you see a parent where they're not engaged and they completely ignore the existence of the child. And sometimes you'll see parents who literally, it's almost as if the child's not on their radar, that they don't have kind of a standard for young kids, for example, attachment response. That's the kind of behavior that one might look for vis-a-vis neglect. Okay? But parental indicators include other things such as parents who make statements about the child where they cannot come up with positive things to say. I was working with a parent-child dyad a number of years ago, and they came in, and the mom started describing all of these horrible things about the kid. And as the session went on, she spent about 45 minutes. And I got more and more concerned. Among other things, she's saying this in front of the kid. And I asked my standard question, which is, well, okay, there are a lot of problems. Are there any things that you like or you feel good about? Now, if that parent were to say no, I would want to ask more questions about how they discipline the child, who cares for the child, and I might go to the point of making a report if I think that there's neglect or direct harm. Partly, it seemed like she was emotionally abusing him in the room. Okay? This parent, however, said to me, "Oh, well, he's a wonderful kid. I mean," and then she went on, and she could have gone on another 45 minutes if we still had more time in the session. So it was like she got tracked into problem saturation rather than being able, by my question, rather than being able to talk about it in a balanced way until I asked. So you want to ask that kind of question, and you want to ask further questions with parents around when they give you clues to clarify whether they're neglecting or abusing the child. Yeah. And in some kind of older both European and Middle Eastern cultures, similarly, you don't praise in public. It means that you'd be giving somebody the evil eye, essentially, right? So, however, there is a real distinction between a parent who berates the child consistently, and when you say, well, do they have any strength, or is there anything that they can do well, where you kind of get at with them, what is their feeling towards the child? Do they feel attached to them? Is there a sense that this is a child they value? And a parent doesn't necessarily have to compliment the child in order to communicate that. This particular parent was from a subculture where one does not generally talk positively about kids, so I was actually rather intrigued that she went on and waxed eloquent about how wonderful this kid was after having basically said all these horrible things about him. But that's an example of parents who can't say anything. And there are a number of positive, and there are a number of other aspects of parental behavior, including when parents say they use implements to discipline their kids, when parents seem to have unrealistic expectations. This is particularly true of younger parents, teen parents, or very young 20s, where they communicate expectations about very young children that are really out of line with the child's capacity. For example, I don't know what's wrong with this kid. You know, I've taught her, but she doesn't answer the phone. Gee, how old is she? She's 14 months. And you know, it's laughable, but there are times when parents have those kinds of expectations that are way out of proportion with the child's actual ability. Sometimes those parents are profoundly uneducated and may have grown up in families where the expectations for kids were really inappropriate. Using out of control discipline, you get the feel. Okay, so parents telling us things that would lead to concern, having them kind of have their own needs met. With respect to physical indicators of abuse in the child, for physical abuse, the primary issue, and because somebody raised earlier, we're not physicians. We're not expected to diagnose and say, aha, this is, among other things, this is a non-organic failure to thrive. That's not within our purview, unless you're a nurse practitioner or a physician. But if there is an injury or some kind of physical harm to a child, either with an inconsistent or non-existent explanation, that should raise concern. It's not always the case that a child's been abused, but it's the inconsistency or the kind of the non-explanation that should raise your concern. Example, the child has bite marks, and they're human bite marks. You can see it, right? And they say, oh, the dog bit me. Well, tell me more about it. Oh, yeah, the neighbor has this like pit bull. No, I don't know. But anyway, the other day, again, laughable, but these are sometimes the inconsistent stories you get. Or a burn mark. There are sometimes when kids get burn marks, it's unusual for the back of the hand. Top of the hand, also with feet during the summer. You'll see bottom of feet, but top of feet, back, very unusual. Okay? If they're patterned, circular, ask what happened. You know, a parent says, ah, you know, they grabbed something from the stove that was circular, maybe it's feasible, and it fell on them. Well, you know, you can get a burn mark if something's hot enough with brief contact with the skin. But if you've got patterned burns and they are, like 4 or 5 circles in a line, that's what happens when a kid puts his hand on the stove. Well, unless that is not a stove to code, usually that's intentional behavior by the parent. Somebody who's the caretaker or parent is taking the child's hand and placing it there. So you want to look for patterns, but most importantly, you want to look for inconsistency. Kid says they have a black eye when they fell off their bike. You know, they can have that explanation. Well, tell me how this happened, and then they change their story because a black eye doesn't quite follow from a bike. I mean, it could, but it's an unusual injury. Usually, it scrapes on forearms and hands. Sometimes scrapes on your head, your back, your legs, your arms. But a black eye? Well, no, actually, yeah, it was kind of like I fell and my handlebar hit me. Well, how did it hit you? Maybe it wasn't my handlebar. So things change and morph. And when you get that kind of inconsistency around physical injury, physical indicators of neglect are, as somebody had raised, like really poor hygiene over time. I know some 8-year-olds I've worked with who refuse to bathe, and much to the chagrin of everybody around them. And their parents have tried valiantly to get them to bathe. It's been the source of physical attacks by the child. Well, okay, but you get a kid who's sustained and non-hygienic, the parents don't seem to care. That is something that would raise my concern about adequate care. Nutrition. When you see kids who are not eating well and very poorly, you may get bloated bellies. With people who are more lightly complected, you may get extreme paleness. With people who are more darkly complected, you may see skin flaking. And if that's coupled with a belly that's distended, that's extreme kind of malnutrition. You want to be aware of that. But again, what's the explanation? They could say, well, I've been sick with such and such, and it's plausible. We could check with parent, but that's, okay, so they had some kind of really significant illness. unattended medical conditions, inappropriate dress for the behavior that's out of style. Those kinds of things you're looking for, aside from the physical plane, you're looking for the child's self-care and care by others. And around sexual abuse, we don't see a lot of the physical manifestations. So if you're working with very young kids doing therapeutic daycare, for example, or you're working in a preschool treatment center, you might be in the position to take a child to the bathroom sometimes, or help them dress, or they may be inappropriately dressed. So we rarely see this, but swelling, vaginal swelling, visible lesions around a penis or vagina or around the anus, those things we're not likely to see, but it's possible for some clinicians to see it. We sometimes see lesions around kids' mouths. That requires a referral to a physician, and if there's a venereal disease or an STD, that's a very good indication that there's been abuse. Not absolute, but a very good, and definitely the basis for a report. Sometimes kids will complain of lower abdominal pain. Obviously, despite our lack of requirement to report it, a pregnancy of a young teen is the tip-off that they've been having sex. And you want to ask the question of with whom. And if there's an age differential, you make a report. Or, as sometimes happen, this teen may have been raped and is refusing to talk about it. Okay, so that is clearly an abuse report as well. Sometimes kids talk about painful lower abdominal complaints, painful urination or defecation, and recent changes in appetites, particularly not so much anorexia, but with bulimia. Maybe more of a correlation. It's not a strong one, but more of a correlation. So you're looking for things that would relate to potential harm vis-a-vis sexual abuse. And then finally, behavioral indicators in kids. There is no such thing as a syndrome for child abuse. There isn't a collection of behaviors or complaints that will prove to us that abuse has happened, or even necessarily mean we have to make a report. There are some things that are more likely, so we want to ask further. But when we see these kinds of behaviors, and I'm going to mention a few of them, it's going to be really obvious to you there could be 30 different possible sources for many of these, or even more. So a child who's very hostile or aggressive, well, that could come from a lot of different sources, not just abuse, but it could be physical abuse among other things. Extreme withdrawal behavior, neglect, physical abuse, deep depression based on a biological function. All kinds of things could happen. A kid who's out of control or easily agitated, ADHD, a kid who has a thyroid imbalance, okay? So we want to ask further about the behavior. The one exception to this is that in about 25% of sexual abuse cases, kids become hypersexual or have an abnormal and kind of obsessive interest in sex. And young kids, we're talking 4, 5, 6 years old. Now, it may be as, quote, innocent, I don't know that it's innocent, unquote, as viewing adult sexual behavior or pornography, but if you see a kid who's very young who has compulsive sexual behavior, there is probably a 1 in 4, or I don't know if it's 1 in 4, but a fairly high chance in our reasonable suspicion idea that this is a kid who has experienced some kind of sexually inappropriate behavior, probably a basis for a report. But the converse isn't true. Just because a kid doesn't show any sexualized behavior does not prove that they have not been sexually abused, because 75% of them who have been sexually abused don't show that kind of behavior. Okay? So it's the one area where there is a symptom that typically, not always, but typically, I should say correlation with